The last module dealt mostly with text, kind of our most traditional unobtrusive measure. It's not quite true because if we're analyzing data from more obtrusive measures, things like surveys or like interviews, then the text itself isn't. But most text that's out there and found in some sense, is a small set of the larger superset of what we might call trace data. And that's not quite true. There is a difference in the kinds of texts we find. Some of it might be designed to be consumed, and some of it might be classified as ephemera, stuff that we are reading that really wasn't intended for us. So, for example, if you want to learn about, the history of Rome or the history of the Roman Empire, you can look at Tacitus. And a number of other Romans, and in late Rome, especially people who did long histories of the Republic. These are designed for us. They're historians writing for the present day and for the future. We're just reading it and thinking about what it is that they're communicating basically to us. Same could be said, for example, of a newspaper article to a certain extent. It's meant for public consumption. And you learn quite a bit from that. But you also can learn from things like the graffiti. Apparently, people throughout the Roman Empire tended to write on their walls. Some of this was advertising, often for things like brothels. Some of it was political speech written on the walls. And so you learn a different set of things when the people who are writing on the walls may not be thinking about the future. They may not be thinking about someone someday looking at their crude drawings or their advertising and trying to infer from it what was happening in society. But that said, we know quite a bit more about that society from that ephemera. Think about, menus. Imagine if you had all the menus that have ever been used in the United States over a period of a century, from restaurants and that sort of thing. What could you glean from this information? And people do look at things like menus, things that have kind of disappeared. What could that tell us about the actual real consumption and desires and tastes of the American public? How people phrase what the food is that is found in there? What kinds of things are held in high esteem in terms of the terminology? The move, for example, to more information about where meats may have come from and how the animals were raised, or some sort of exotic food from another country and how it is made exotic through the menu itself. So there's a great deal we could figure out from those menus, but those menus are not designed for us, right? They were designed to be sort of thrown away. To give another example of this, I recently went with my kids to the British Museum, where all the things are that have been, let's say, collected rather than stolen from the world. And I'd been there several times before, but this was the first visit for my teenagers, and I knew to get there early in the morning. And I also knew that there would be a crowd around the Rosetta Stone. It sits right in the middle, right after you get through the entrance. And frankly, there was enough of a crowd there, even getting in at opening, that we couldn't really see. Like, you had to kind of look over people to be able to see the Rosetta Stone, just to see the Rosetta Stone. Why? Because, obviously the Rosetta Stone ends up being a kind of landmark of understanding our past. But I had a suspicion, and this was the wrong suspicion, that there would be a bigger crowd around a particular artifact that had gotten a lot of buzz online. This is the oldest complaint letter. This is the letter to Ea Natsir, which was a cuneiform letter that was written from a customer, Nani, to a copper dealer, Ea Natsir, in Ur, around 1750 BCE. And basically it says, no, take this back, your copper sucks. And if you read it in translation, it feels like it could be an email to someone selling copper today. That's kind of why it got popular, because it felt very, very familiar, despite the fact that it had been, pressed into cuneiform and delivered by a servant. It could very easily have been someone complaining about, the stuff they had gotten at a shop, in New York or something. The familiarity of it was kind of striking. So I expected if I went in that I would see people gather around. And in fact, no, we actually had to hunt for it. It's like on the third floor in the piles and piles of clay tablets they have, like a little shelf, and nobody cared, except for me, I guess. But that's kind of that other contrast, right? So this was as sort of ephemeral as you can get. It was a complaint letter. That it managed to survive, 3 millennia basically, was the only surprising part of it. But you can learn a lot more of the day-to-day life of people by reading their complaint letters than you do by kind of translating their more. You learn differently about that society by knowing kind of what their everyday communications look like. As I said, these kinds of textual findings are a subset of a larger group of data that I might call trace data. And trace data is the kind of datification process is largely, there is certainly datification of things like music and books, so that I can now legal questions aside, I could now download a library and look through it at a large scale. This is something like Google Book Trends, right? I can do a lot more with this data because I don't have to scan it. Well, in fact, part of the reason we could do it is because Google did have a huge book scanning project where they digitized this stuff. But now that books are born digital, even that step is less important, and they just kind of show up in a way that can be analyzed beyond the kind of reader reading it. But a lot of this datafication is not of things like books or music or video content, television, not that stuff, but kind of things that go under the radar, records that are automatically generated, and really in most cases get deleted, but those streams can be captured, and these leave footprints, digital footprints of individuals and of societies. And so the kind of move towards datafication really changes what social scientists can do. In kind, but mostly in scale and the kinds of things we can do. So I'll talk about that in just a second. What are the advantages of this? And as with text, one of the big advantages is these are unobtrusive, generally unobtrusive measures. That is, we aren't interacting with the people that we're studying, and therefore we don't have to worry about whether our questions, our probes, the situations we put them in, the context in which we're gathering this data is affecting our subjects in some way. This is traditionally called the Hawthorne effect, and there's with a lot of these effects, it's a just so story. The people have gone back now and looked at some of these effects, the survivor effect, which you've probably seen as the question of the fighter plane, and a bunch of these others. And really, the stories are rarely as neat as the effect that gets named after them. But the idea behind the Hawthorne effect was this study of time and motion, basically a time and motion study of people working on an assembly line. And the researchers went in and they increased. I have some pretty bright lights here so that you can see my beautiful face while I'm recording. They increased the lighting on this assembly line to a large degree, and efficiency improved. People moved more quickly. And then they went back and the experiment was over, and so they turned the lights off back down to where they had been before, and it improved again. It seemed that whoever they interviewed seemed to work a little bit harder. And this is kind of the classic observer effect, right? Which is simply by studying these people, not being me, but the researchers had changed what they were doing. This is the old management kind of, and it's been attributed to a number of different kind of management, either gurus or researchers or writers, this idea that what's measured is managed. And the idea here is that if you are studying something that kind of changes by your, not observation, but your kind of pointed observation, by being there, by watching. This is kind of the idea of the panopticon too, right? Which is that your behavior changes when you know you're being watched. So does it change when you're being spied on? Which is really what trace data is, right? That we are all producing all of this data through our interactions with the world around us, or other people, the systems we interact with, and it's leaving this trace data, but we're not really aware of it in the same way that we are aware of, say, a camera in the corner. That those two things are slightly different. And so the big advantage, I think, of trace data is the unobtrusive nature of that data, that we get, I think, we are more likely to get something that is more accurate if we are pulling from trace, because we are not asking people, we're not involving people in that process in the same way. The big disadvantage is, in many cases, we have to do more work to infer what that means. There is that ongoing the one that I'm sure you've heard, this question of whether the pizza shops near the Pentagon are busy. And it's so widely known that people just kind of joke about it. It's also true that they moved a lot of the food services inside the Pentagon for this reason. It's not just a joke. This kind of question of what you can monitor is really a counter-surveillance question as well. But it is so widely known that it's almost a truism that if we're about to invade a country, say Grenada or say, I don't know, it depends on what week it is, Greenland, that they're going to be very busy ordering pizza into the Pentagon during the 24 hours before that. Now, I think at this point that is so widely known that it is a bit of a joke, but it's also, you can think of parallels to that, and those continue to be important indicators beyond that. Of course, it could also just be that it's the end of the fiscal year or something, so people have to burn the midnight oil because of that. There's tons of reasons to lucubrate besides invading a country. That said, it does seem to be an indicator of something when there's an increase in people in the area, or when there's an increase in the food they're ordering late into the night. So but what does that mean, right? So that inference question is the big question. I'm sitting here doing this, and I wear recently kind of this, it's a smart ring, an Oura ring for tracking my sleep. And when I see it, I say, oh my gosh, I'm exhausted. It's late. I need to go to sleep. So it isn't unobtrusive exactly. Something stuck, some big chunky thing stuck on your finger is not exactly unobtrusive. So it may not be the best example. but it is somewhat unobtrusive, and it doesn't measure that much, right? It's a simple log that's measuring a few things. It's measuring, I don't even think it measures motion, but it's measuring my my pulse, and it's a pulse oximeter basically on my finger, right? And it's certainly not as obtrusive as at one point I had to do a 24-hour, I don't know if any of you have had to do this, but a 24-hour blood pressure test, and every 5 minutes the blood pressure cuff would inflate, which was really fun for driving, like when you're going and all of a sudden you feel like whatever. That was pretty obtrusive, right? This is far less so. I will worry it because it's a ring, but it's kind of just sitting there. But what do you get out of that? Well, you get this data, and it does do a surprisingly good job of figuring out whether I'm asleep or not. Right? It can measure that my pulse has dropped. It can measure that it is not, that it has dropped. Kind of the derivative of this has dropped, like the how often it changes. Whenever I'm doing this, my pulse is going up and down, depending on how I'm talking, depending on how I'm moving. But when you're asleep, you tend to have more of a flat line, and so it can infer from this a bunch of stuff. How valid or accurate is that? I don't know. It's certainly more valid or accurate than nothing, which is kind of what you do with a lot of this. It definitely seems to infer something, but the validity question is a little bit tricky. And sometimes it infers things that you don't expect, right? This was an ongoing issue of a number of different sleep trackers, which was that it knew how often you were having sex in many cases, right? Because if you were having sex mostly in bed, like an old person, then it could kind of infer that you were active in bed during a certain time, right? So and everyone was shocked that this was, I think, Sleep Aid or somebody. One of the companies had all this data that they'd actually very easily analyzed. It was hard to ignore this. That told them how often their users were having sex. So sometimes you get things that you wouldn't think about, right? And so there's I think I mentioned before, there are experiments now to have smart speakers where you ask for them to turn on your pasta timer. There have been a number of experiments that measure the timbre of someone's voice and can do things like, on a large scale, predict whether colds or a flu are about to move through an area, or perhaps cognitive decline, or in the case that I think I've volunteered now for a case that they're doing out of Mayo Clinic that measures heart health based on how you talk to your smart device. So there's some really interesting stretches you can make from these interactions and pull from it. Now, as I said, this is a huge shift into datafication, but it is not brand new. If I asked you what are the earliest cases of sociology, not anthropology, but sociology, there are a few things that would come up. In the American context, you were probably looking at some of the urban sociologists that were looking largely at Chicago, but at other large cities. And often they were making use of data that came out of the city, things like crime data, things like housing, these kinds of birth, death, transit, like how many people had come in. All of these things were language use in particular areas. All of these were data largely that were being collected already, but the sociologists could get access to them, especially in the U.S. context. They did go out and sit and talk to families and do interviews and a bunch of other stuff, but a lot of it was this trace data. And I think in the European context, most people will mark the beginning. I mean, there are earlier beginnings all the way to Descartes, but most will mark kind of the beginning of this as Durkheim's suicide studies. And these were studies again where Durkheim was using data that was being collected already, that was already kind of being pulled together with some serious issues. Right, the problem with suicide then, especially, and still to a certain extent, is that it was considered sinful in Christianity, and so people would try to hide suicides and make it look like a regular, a natural death or murder, even, because that was better than the admission that someone had committed suicide. So these records, when you start to compare them, you have to keep in mind some of the social pieces to this, right? That it might be interpreted differently in Nice than it would in the north, from the south and the north, and from country to country. So all of that you would have to build into it rather than just accepting the data as being correct, which, although Durkheim does note in some cases the problem of collection, how to what extent that problem affects his conclusions is not really examined. I'm getting off track a bit, but all to say that for sociologists, social scientists more broadly, the use of trace data has a very long history, usually with something else, but also just on its own. But especially as we went into the digital era, there was just way more of that to use. I think the sort of quintessential example of measuring, especially log data, which is kind of the basic form of trace data, is the kind of web analytics. Now, that's not the only place we get log data, right? I mean, this classic log data is something like, when people clock in and clock out at work, right? So that gives you a very clear case of, how often has this person come to work? Are they late consistently? You had to do this for accounting. And honestly, accounting records are a huge source of trace data, right? You can kind of forensically examine who gets paid and when, and really infer quite a bit out of that process. This is why some of both the intelligence agencies and the policing agencies in the US like to hire CPAs so that they can engage in this kind of forensic tracing. But, these were already being collected to kind of keep track of things, and you could use those to make some inferences. In the case of the web, early on, these were really error logs. You wanted to know how often people were hitting your website, whether it was ever kind of crashing, whether they were trying to get to pages that didn't exist because of a 404. You could kind of go through as a human being and look through this log and figure out kind of, were things kind of, clipping along at some rate. And then those logs started to get longer as you started to get more and more people visiting websites and going through by hand and trying to look at it. There's generally the basic web server then and now, although there are different kinds of logs. Well, basically had three different logs. I'll leave the error log aside. It really wasn't something we were looking at for analytics, but they had a sort of an access log and a referrer log. Strangely, referrer was spelled incorrectly, but it just stuck with one R instead of twos. Anyway, those were the two major log files then, and still, because frankly, web servers haven't changed all that much in their structure, they're still the two major kind of internal logs of how people are using those servers. And so you'd have just this line with, this was the first kind of really big data. At this point, at some point, those got so long that you weren't going to be able to read it by hand. If you tried to load it into a text editor or something to actually look at this file, often it was too big. So you'd have to split up that file before you could even try to look at it as a human being. But even just looking at it as a human being, once it got to be this long, what are you going to do with that? And one of the things you could do with it is put it into a program where it counted up how many hits you got, right? And then you could look at it and say, okay, when are those hits coming in? Do they, we have the time for each one of these accesses. Do we get a whole bunch of them at a particular time and not at other times? Where were they coming from? You were getting the IP addresses they were coming from, so you could maybe infer a little bit about where people might be visiting from. You could watch as the time, as the time went by, what zone of the world was now accessing your site. Especially with referrer data, you could find out where people were coming from, and you can start to trace people through their visit at your site and how long they spent at each page, the dwell time, and kind of what the chances were they were going to move on to another page in your site, whether there were dead ends on your site where people just stopped there and then disappeared, right? Because you could only really get the data at this point from your site itself. But by analyzing these logs, which were very simple, here's a request for this page from this IP address at this time. Assuming that you could kind of link those together by IP address over time, you could start to do traces as people move through the site, and you could do maps where you showed how people moved through the site and which pages were most visited and all the rest of this stuff. So that kind of web analytics really started to build this idea of using analytics. And a lot of those analytical ideas, even though people were certainly doing business analytics more broadly, and people were certainly doing sort of transportation logistics analytics, often they started to take from what was happening on the web, because people were developing tools on the web that could be used elsewhere. One of the big steps here was going from those logs on an individual server to starting to do cross-site tracking, right? So if you could attach an identifier to either an IP address, or more likely to something that just sat on your browser as a cookie, or something that identified your browser or your computer, or your phone in the case of an IMEI or something like that, or more likely your phone in the case of what's called advertiser ID. All those things could then kind of put a tag on the person moving not just from through a site, but from site to site. So, for example, if you have Firefox, or if you have a browser that will track this, you can see as Facebook, for example, or Meta or Google, how it just kind of checks as you're moving from place to place and traces you through the web. This is why when you look at those shoes and then you decide they're way too expensive, you get served ads for them. If you don't have serious ad blocking, you get served ads for them wherever you go. It feels like they're sneaking up behind you wanting to be bought, right? It's because they saw you do that. They know how long you looked at those shoes. You may have looked at them more than once, and now they are going to track you down because they know that they are ever so close to closing that. Especially once the nature of the web shifted to be an advertising platform, Google being the largest advertising company in the world, once we shifted to that and the advertising model changed from let's get this out to as wide a group of people, let's build something, this is kind of mass advertising and marketing, right? Mass, I don't want to go too far down this, but because we probably hit it in another course, but we had this massification of production and of media and of advertising, going through basically through the end of the 1800s all the way into the middle to late 1900s, where you can do it two ways. You can think about it two ways. I think the traditional way to think about it is that mass production, the assembly line and industrialization, made for really large production of products, and so you needed to find a market for that. So you had to have build a mass media so you could then engage in mass advertising. I actually think I think it's probably both, but I think it goes the other way around as well, which is that mass media required mass advertising to support it, and that mass advertising required mass products, and so it actually drove it the other direction as well. But especially around the end of the 1900s, we start to see much more stratification and targeting of ads and of products. So we've gone from huge massification. Some of that still exists, of course. This is kind of like fast fashion and that sort of thing. So you do have that at the huge level, but you also see a great deal more customization and seeking smaller markets and exploiting those small markets. And part of the reason for that is that we can now target advertising and marketing to a very small group of people. We can identify, if you haven't, and if you're old enough to use Facebook, you should take a look and see what Facebook thinks about you. You can dig in and see the sort of profile they've given you that allows marketers to decide how to market to you. And you can get it down to, especially considering location and things like that, you can market to a few dozen people, right? By very narrowly trimming what it is you want to get out in a Facebook ad or in a Google ad. So this tracing, kind of following you, especially over time, lets you know a whole bunch of data about where you go throughout the web and attaches it to an ID that's attached to you personally. It's not just where you go on the web, right? Waze tracks you, Uber tracks you. A bunch of the apps on your device track your physical location in addition. They can tell when you walk into a shop. When you walk into a shop, they can tell whether you've been to their website and are now walking into their shop. They can tell what you looked at on that website, where you went in the shop if they're using beacons, and whether you looked at the same thing in the shop. The amount of being able to connect this data is really pretty extreme. I think that it's getting a lot more attention now because of a few things, right? So I think the big one that got attention was an article that showed up in the New York Times that talked about how Target had sent a young woman information about diapers ahead of before she had told her parents that she was pregnant at home, and they had figured this out by looking and seeing that she was looking at baby related stuff, right? And so they targeted this ad directly to her. She didn't know they were doing this, and so it was this very weird situation where basically Target told her parents that she was pregnant because they started serving her these physical ads, sending a mailer with with congratulations and discounts for her upcoming baby. So that one was kind of a bit of a wake-up call. I mean, I don't think a lot of people really realized how closely something like Target was targeting you. I think fewer people recognize that, for example, your purchase history through your credit card is not private. It's generally sellable and sold. Unless you work in this area or touch this area in some way. And even when you do, you probably don't even recognize the full extent of the data that is available. The reason it isn't used is because it can get expensive if you're using all of it, right? Which we'll come back to for us, because we may not have the money to use a lot of this stuff. But it's just a huge amount of information. Now that location data is coming up more recently because of a service that is called Fog Reveal, and is doing things like tracing everybody who's at a protest, and then they can kind of look at this data. They're using something that kind of tracks people's IMEIs by essentially spoofing the local cell tower, and they can figure out everybody's what phones everybody has. That tracks back to who they are, and they can look and say, okay, where do these people sleep every night? And Fog Reveal provides that. How do they get that? Well, they buy this data from all of the services that are tracking you and that you have allowed to track on your phone. So because each of these apps because you have given permission for each of these apps to track you, they then have that data. And the presumption is that they're only going to use it for themselves. In fact, many of them then resell that data to someone that batches it and sells it on. So Fog Reveal can take all of this data, can combine it with the data that police forces are gathering in a local place, and then connect that to kind of where people are coming from in that space. And so I think we've seen some examples of this for ICE showing up at people's doors or calling people by their name because they can get this data from their presence nearby. They can also, of course, get this data from facial recognition, and I think that we've seen a huge increase in that piece too. But the facial recognition by itself is not as valuable if it cannot be linked to all of this other data. So what do we take from all of this? One is that simple data can be combined into something really significant. So even if you just have log data, something coming in on the web or something stuck on your finger giving you this, once you start to combine that, once you start to link that over time, once you start to trace patterns in that, that alone, taking a very simple, I mean, literally a heartbeat in this case, right? Taking something very simple and linking it over time can actually give you some pretty significant insights just by doing that. So kind of the analytics around a single stream of data is incredibly valuable. But then if you can find the linkages to combine it with other data, even if that's just looking at similar times or looking at connections, people that have been in the same place at the same time, once you start to build the connections to this, it becomes extraordinarily powerful. It can give you quite a bit of information about both people on an individual level and at a social level. And once you do that, once you've got that kind of larger picture, some of the potential downsides of using trace data, namely that you have to infer quite a bit, are reduced somewhat because of these multiple things kind of backing each other up and giving you a bigger picture, the validity of those observations tends to go up. Now, again, this raises incredibly large privacy issues, whether it's ethical to use this data in the same way that marketers do. It raises issues of access. As a regular everyday researcher, I cannot afford these data unless I'm, in many cases, working for a government agency that's already getting that data or a marketing company or another company that already has access to that data. Usually it's hard for me to go out and kind of buy this stuff because it's just too expensive. There are other ways to get it, and I've talked about this before, about people volunteering their data and a bunch of other pieces, but generally it's a little harder for me to get. And those are just two of a whole list of issues that we have in terms of making use of these data. Putting that access bit aside and putting the ethical question of how we should and can access this data aside, it does provide us a picture of society that we've never had before. It gives us an amazing amount of sort of ephemeral detail about how people live and work through their everyday lives. It can be dangerously seductive because we assume we're getting it all. As long as we're reflexive about that and recognize that this isn't the whole picture, it's just a very rich picture, we can take that tapestry and start to fill it in with some of the other methods we've used. We can use this to kind of, again, I'm a big fan of using these large-scale quantitative approaches to map the territory that we can then use to kind of go to the right places and do the kind of nuanced, detailed work that is often much more qualitative in a more effective way because we kind of know where we're trying to get. So, trace data, yay.